This is Steve Zeltzer. I'm with Work Week, and we are going to be looking this afternoon about the history of Argentina, the struggles there of the working class, and also the experiences they've had with the military coup and the role of the United States and the struggle today in the working class in Argentina and tactics that workers' organizations have used there. I'm speaking with Guillermo Kane. He's the one of the leaders of the Workers' Party in Argentina, and he's been active. He's also a professor of history. Welcome to Work Week.
Hi, thank you, Steve.
Why don't you talk first about the recent history of the movement in Argentina? There was a military coup. There was a big workers' movement in Argentina, and there was mass repression of the working class. Thousands were arrested and many killed. I mean, I would say that workers in the United States, working people, need to look at some of the experiences of Argentina and reflect on what is possible here. So, can you talk about that history and what happened during the military coup, and also the role of the United States?
Okay, sure. To give it a bit of context, in 1969, when there was also workers and students uprising in many countries between 1968 and 99. We had the process in France with workers and students. We had in Mexico, we obviously in the States as well, different very important processes of struggle. In Argentina, there was a working class and youth uprising against a military dictatorship that was led by General Onganía. The first big upheaval of which was in the province of Córdoba, and it was known as the Cordobazo. And this was what this was a protest, a strike after the killing of a student in another province, in a neighboring province, at a protest by the dictatorship, and this coincided with several working class demands because the military was trying to take away half a day of leave that factory workers had in this province on Saturdays. And so those two things came together and it turned into an active strike, not a passive strike as the trade union bureaucracy often tries to impose, but a situation where workers left the factories and marched in columns to the center of the city of Cordoba, and the military dictatorship tried to repress this. And what happened was, for 48 hours, workers and students took over the city of Cordoba against the dictatorship. So this was a turning point after many years where repression and the pressure of trade union bureaucracy and the bourgeois nationalist movement of Peronismo as a leadership had tried to contain. And this signaled a very strong increase in worker struggles. Okay.
And what was Peronismo? What was Peronism? What did that represent?
It depends how much time you have. It's a subject which has libraries written on it. But to try to make it short, Perón was a military general who was part of a military coup in 1943, and who had a political strategy which favored the incorporation into the state of the trade union bureaucracy and the structures of trade unions. So he, in exchange for concessions to demands which the workers' movement had long struggled for, there was a process where that working class movement, which came from internationalist, socialist, communist, anarchist ideas, was to a great extent incorporated into a bourgeois national movement. Perón personally was an admirer of Mussolini, and he certainly received many Nazis, as is one of the most known facts about our country, probably in the U.S., usually mentioned in the U.S. media. but it wasn't a fascistic government. It was what Trotsky explained, for example, in writings regarding Cárdenas in Mexico. Uh, it was the sort of Bonapartist government that you have um, in countries which are dominated by imperialism, which you know kind of uses the workers to clash against imperialism and sometimes sides with the bosses and imperialisms against the workers and tries to put itself as an arbiter above classes, but is really looking out for bourgeois nationalism. We have a series of videos which we put out a month ago on YouTube on the history of Peronism in Argentina, which is a subject much discussed locally and abroad. There are some historians in the U.S. and in other countries which have discussed Peronism to varying results and and positions, right? But this is what Peronism is, and Perón was ousted by a military coup in '55, and for many years, Peronism as a force was forbidden. It was under prescription. So what happened after the Cordobazo in '69 was that a big radicalization of the masses started in the workers, in the youth, and there was a push for Peronism to sort of channel that. And the bourgeoisie changed decisions and decided to bring Perón back from exile to allow him to present himself in elections, and for this to be a way to to channel this sort of working class movement, which for the first time was not going behind Peronismo, but was where socialist ideas had more and more ground, and particularly something which was called class struggle trade unionism, what we call clasismo, started to become a very important factor. These are unions which were not only in struggle against the bosses or against the dictatorship, but which were also fiercely independent from the trade union bureaucracy and viewed it as an enemy, and the need for recuperating the trade unions. Okay, and important trade unions in big metalworks plants, in automobile industry, among other places, fell into the hands of these sort of revolutionary leftist currents where different groups acted, including the predecessor of the Partido Obrero, of my organization, which was founded in 1964 with the name Política Obrera, Workers' Policy or Politics, and which, though was a very young organization at that point, played a part in all these struggles and a process of organization in the working class. So what happened then is in 1973, well, I won't go into the details of it, but Peronism gets back into power with a left sector that goes inside Peronism and says Perón could establish socialism in Argentina. But from the first moment he comes to power, he sets up, he supports on the right wing of his movement and on the trade union bureaucracy, and really enacts a massacre against the whole process of workers and youths, including those who hailed him as a leader and said they were part of his movement. He said they were infiltrated, Marxists infiltrated into his movement. And after a period where he tries to form something called the Social Pact, which was in theory an agreement between bosses and workers that both prices and wages would stay fixed by the state, but which was actually, of course, there had been a price hike previous to the pact. And, well, besides the details of it, but once the workers' movement and strikes and struggles got underway, what Perón and then he died in 1974, and his wife took over the government, and his second wife, Isabel Perón, and relied strongly on the right wing of the government, which organized a brigade called the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, the AAA, which murdered hundreds of activists, both of the Marxist independent left and of the Peronist left. In those years, we had the biggest general strike called without the trade union bureaucracy in 1975. So that whole process, the organization of the working class manages to be able to organize a general strike that was not called by the CGT, the CGT, which is the, what would be the American AFL-CIO, which is Peronista, or has a Peronista leadership. And there are coordinadoras, coordination bodies of local, of rank and file delegates, trade union delegates or steward, and by area. So you have in the different cities in the greater Buenos Aires area in particular, the delegates of each factory. And when there is a very strong devaluation of the peso under that government in 1975, and the government does not accept any trade union, how do you call it, a wage arrangement, when there's a new
contract or a deal,
yeah,
with the contract.
yeah, a deal, any trade union deal that meant a wage increase after this devaluation, the government disavowed. So this generated a situation where workers started going on strike through these local coordinations without the leadership of the trade union bureaucracy, and against the Peronist government. So this is very important because workers are supposed to be Peronist, right? So this wasn't supposed to exist. And the left and revolutionary tendencies had a very strong participation on a factory level, on a local company level in this whole process. And though that strike triumphed, finally the CGT had to call for the strike, and the ministers who had founded the AAA gangs, and the minister who had done the finance minister who had done the devaluation had to leave, and they had to sign all the trade union deals. So that was like a partial victory. What happened was that Peronista government was finished. What happened was, in the left, there wasn't really a common project for power, and a large part of the left had been tailing Peronismo. And the bourgeoisie decided that it had to take extreme measures to end this revolutionary process in the working class and the youth. So what they did, and was call for a new military coup, which of course was not news. I mean, Argentina has had many military coups between 1930 and 1976. Now, unlike many of these coups, it did not have the idea of just removing one government and calling for new elections, or even just a prolonged and more generally repressive dictatorship like the 1966 one had been. But what this coup carried out was a genocide, was a systematic assassination of the working class activists in particular, and in general, a whole generation of militants that had been very strong in Argentina, and that had founded new organizations like PO and others, where the armed guerrilla organizations were a part of it, but which had mainly been defeated by the state prior to the coup. I say this because in presentations of the military dictatorship in Argentina, which took power in '76, it's often supposed that Montoneros or ERP, which were like the two largest military organizations, are the reason for the coup, or cited as such, and this is not real. In 1975, for example, the ERP, which is an ex-Trotskyist Guevarista organization, had had suffered a terrible military defeat due to intelligence infiltration in their ranks, and had virtually no capacity for military operations anymore. So what the real objective of the military dictatorship, if you look at the social makeup of the 30,000 desaparecidos, you know, desaparecidos disappeared
Hmm.
because what the military dictatorship did is it set up clandestine detention centers and task forces. It absorbed these groups like the AAA that we talked about a little while ago that had been acting before the coup. And what it did was it set up, of course, an absolutely iron fist, like a state of siege, a permanent state of siege, and it kidnapped militants, their families, their close ones, tortured them, killed them, had them in secret concentration camps, but with no official legal situation. And so their loved ones and families, in many cases didn't know where they were or what had happened to them. Supposed that the dictatorship had done something to them, but if for many years it's been a very long work of reconstructing, what happened to many of these militants and comrades who were assassinated, what happened to their children, who in many cases were kidnapped and given to different, families or families
Rich families.
of military.
I know about the Nobel case where the
Oh
business.
no, but there are hundreds of
Yeah,
cases.
but that's one of the more well-known families that
Ah, you mean yeah, the
the
Noble,
Nobel, yeah, who where
yeah,
they
they
got
are the
killed.
owners of the main of the most important newspaper and now multimedia group in the country, which is Clarín. Yes, and there's one of their children is supposed to have been given by the dictatorship, though their identity has not been established to this day because of the power that this family exercises. Yes.
And we're speaking with Guillermo Kane. He is a leader of the Workers' Party in Argentina. And Guillermo, what was the role of the United States in this military coup, particularly in relationship to Ford and other U.S. multinationals that were in Argentina?
Well, first of all, the U.S. played a very important role previous to the coup and during the coup in forming the military assassins and torture methods. Of course, they are not alone in this. For example, French officers active in the repression of the Algerian liberation struggle had been forming mil- uh, military personnel in Argentina for decades. But the School of the Americas, which was hosted by the U.S. military, and where they formed dictators and assassins who acted all over the continent, was one of the main places where these methods of torture and assassination and large-scale repression, which resulted in 30,000 killed between 1976 and 1983, were formed. So that in the first place, and of course the U.S. Economic and political and diplomatic presence in Argentina played a very large role during the whole process. And many foreign companies, not just the U.S., but definitely in Ford, which I think is what you're referring to, there was a detention center within the complex of its factory here in the north of the greater Buenos Aires area in Tigre. There's now a center for memory of the fallen that has been put together there. And so and for example, the German Mercedes Benz, the same thing. What did they do? Their human resources teams pinpointed who of their employees were leftist militants, or they suspected to be leftist militants, out to the dictatorship, and the dictatorship kidnapped and assassinated them. In the case of Ford, on the premises of the factory itself, in space given to them by the company to carry out this terrible tasks.
So in other words, US multinationals were directly involved in the assassination and murder of trade unionists in Argentina for the purpose of supporting the coup and
Oh,
supporting the military
absolutely.
government.
Yeah, and of course, the companies themselves played a big role in calling for the coup, because the bourgeoisie, both local and foreign, made public statements about the necessity for a military government to end with demands and mobilizations by workers and other sectors of the masses. So not only once the dictatorship was established did they actively collaborate with the assassination of workers, but they were definitely a driving force for its establishment.
And of course, now with a threatened coup insurrection in the United States, it's kind of coming home to roost the tactics of the United States and other countries now, and a attempted insurrection and coup in the United States. Now, in the collapse of the economy, maybe you can talk about that, the occupations that took place, workers' control, that whole struggle. There have been many videos about it. The Buenos hotel workers, tile factory workers took over. The response of the working class to this economic collapse in Argentina is very important. Why don't you talk about what happened and then the lessons of that struggle?
Yeah, sure. Okay, there were several movements which were very important, and I think you're mostly referring to more or less the time around the 2001 popular rebellion. Uh, these are of course times in which I have participated in personally, so I know them not only from what I have studied, but from being there. So what happened? It was a growing process with the Menem government, who was in government for 10 years until '99, and then with De la Rua, which was a coalition between a center-left sector, which came from Peronismo, and the other traditional bourgeois party of Argentina, which are the radical party, what's called radical. They're not what you in the U.S. understand as radicals, but they're a bourgeois, another bourgeois party. And the De la Rua government went into a very strong period of economic recession, which had already begun under the previous government, and a very strong foreign debt crisis, which is absolutely recurrent because foreign debt for countries like Argentina, and this is true all over Latin America and in the semi-colonial countries in general, is not, is an active chain of domination, which is handled in such a way by the IMF, the World Bank, the private sectors of financial capital, that it is absolutely impossible to pay, and always reappears as a crisis every very few years here in Argentina. To this day, we're in the midst of a foreign debt crisis. But okay, there was a very important one in 2001, and so we had mass unemployment, and one of the important characteristics, together with the occupied factories, which you mentioned, which I'd go to, was a mass unemployed workers movement, which came together in the late 90s. And by the time of the 2001, was a main actor in the class struggle in Argentina, and which to this day, under different political characteristics, remains absolutely crucial. So the unemployed workers, which Marx talked about as the reserve army of capital and a pressure against active workers, in Argentina, we managed to organize a significant part of those hundreds of thousands of unemployed or millions of unemployed into part of a unity of action with the occupied working class. Okay, so this was one of the very important movements. We started also in different trade unions to win back leadership against the bureaucracy in those years. This is now more important, but in those years it had already started. Teachers' unions, local factory organizations. It was maybe just beginning, but the left was already 20 years ago starting to gain ground in, on a shop steward level or sometimes local union level. And what happened with the complete economic fallout when they stopped paying the debt, when the De La Rua government fell, and the debt was declared unpayable by the Peronist government that assumed, and there was a devaluation, and there was a very strong economic fallout, was many of the factories that closed, workers occupied them and put them into production with the sometimes very little capital they had, but as a way to try to still earn a living, and it ended up in most cases forming cooperatives. Now these were hundreds of factories, especially around 2002, 2003. Oh, you mentioned a few of them. Of course, as the Sanon factory, which is a tile factory in Neuquén. It's a province in the south of the country, in Patagonia, where actually all of the factories of the tile workers union in that province have gone under workers' control. And well, there are many cases over the country. This was able to be sustained because of the general process of struggle, because the left, the unemployed workers, the class struggle trade unions, the student centers and federations, which were recovered by the left, were present physically defending these occupations against the police, which was sent by the bosses who had closed them down, shut them down, but then wanted to be able to, sell the machines or whatever, even when they were when they owed thousands and thousands of pesos to the workers who were being left without their pay and without any way to earn a living. So very near where I'm living right now, I think about 10, 15 blocks, for example, there was a factory that made suits, a clothing factory, textiles, where Bruckmann, where there was a huge repression in 2003 against the workers, where there was thousands of us facing up against police to defend those occupations. So some of them have been able to subsist, of course, under capitalism and without state support. The problem you get is that wages tend to be very low in these cooperatives, and they've fallen into wages below union level. And in many cases, they've been transformed into sort of outsourced, satellites of bigger companies who say, okay, this is the capital, these are the materials, the raw materials or whatever to process, and start to sort of dominate the economic reality of these workers' control. It depends on the consciousness and the level of organization, but it's definitely an experience which is part of the struggle of the Argentine working class. What we demand is, together with workers' control, there has to be state support for these companies to be able to guarantee union level wages for all the workers, because going to the capitalist market in a moment where capitalism is still functioning, a workers' cooperative that does not have access to bank loans, capital, that does not have capital behind it, what starts happening is that the machines, the capital you have in the company starts deteriorating, and the only immediate way that can be sustained in competition is with greater self-exploitation of the workers. So what we have done within this movement is to call for a struggle towards the state to recognize the existence of these worker-controlled companies and to support it and to struggle for that, because that's the only way that you're going to at least be able to maintain both production and decent wages for these workers.
Now, the you and other parties in Argentina, left parties, Trotskyist parties, have joined together in a united front, or in a bloc in Argentina. What brought that about? How was that organized? What is the program of this bloc? You were formerly in the parliament as one of the representatives of this bloc. Why don't you talk about the history of that, how it came about, and what its role is today in Argentina?
Okay. Well, I think something that in some way the U.S. left, it would be interesting for the U.S. left to catch on, is that this happened in a moment where there was a very strong divide in the bourgeoisie, a very strong political divide between Kirchnerismo, which has been the latest expression of Peronism, who had a clash with a sector of the bourgeoisie over how to handle an economic crisis. They tried to tax the owners of the agriculture, of the farming sectors, specifically soy, which had very high international prices at that point, and which Argentina is a big producer of. And around this and how to handle the economic crisis in 2008-9 was a very strong divide. So the bosses or the capitalists of the agricultural sector led a very strong clash against the government, which the right-wing opposition and part of the left sided with against them. You know, processes similar to maybe what not the same, but what has happened in Venezuela or in other places where you have big right-wing oppositions of a populist government, or whatever you want to call them, these bourgeois nationalist government, which managed to mobilize, popular sectors. So the Partido Obrero and a few other parties of the left maintained the position of class independence when the general trend was for everybody to take one of the two bourgeois sides. So you had like the Communist Party and other sectors linked to Venezuelan Chavismo, who maybe were not part of the government before, but incorporated into the Peronist government. And you had other sectors, even of the left, supporting an opposition movement, but which was going behind the big landowners and a sector of capital. Okay, so for example, the Maoists, the Revolutionary Communist Party, the PCR, the MST, or Trotskyist sector, and others marched with the organizations of the big landowners in defense of their properties and not paying taxes. So and of course the taxes weren't going to go to the people. The taxes were to pay the foreign debt. So we couldn't support that either, because that was not that was not a redistribution of wealth, but it was a fiscal conflict where what the government wanted was, in the most part, to guarantee funds for paying the foreign debt and also to bail out different capitalist groups. So they wanted to, for example, they took money away from pensioners to give it to General Motors that year in that crisis. So what they wanted was to have a bigger fund, a bigger box, chest for capitalist bailouts, right? So in the PO and other organizations had an independent position. And then the other thing that happened, apart from having an independent position and several positions in the class struggle, was there was a case of a political assassination of a comrade of our organization of PO, was Mariano Ferreira, by the government in 2010. Well, not by the government, but by union bureaucracy thugs aligned with the government, to be a bit more specific. And Mariano Ferreira and other comrades of ours were supporting a protest of railway workers who did not get union pay because they were part of cooperatives or outsourced companies, which were used to try to hide the fact that they actually worked for the railway workers. This is a sort of labor fraud which is very extended in Argentina during that whole period under Kirchnerismo, where practically very few people or almost nobody got into, like the jobs which had union conditions, and all sorts of different ways, independent worker, you say you're formally self-employed,
So
or you've
subcontracting,
yeah,
deregulation,
subcontracts, forming
part-time
cooperatives,
workers.
all sorts of formulas, which were basically to generate, second-rate labor, or without stability, without unionization. This was a very extended reality. It was done with the complicity of the trade union bureaucracy, which in this case, and in many cases, were actually transformed into bosses of these outsourced companies. Okay, so when the PO and other groups supported the movement of these workers who were demanding to be recognized by the railway as direct employees and to have the benefits, stability, and pay that entitled, what happened was this trade union bureaucracy, who was making a profit off of this situation, actually organized an armed assault against the protest. Okay, so our comrade, a 22-year comrade, was by the name of Mariano Ferreira, was killed, and other comrades were severely injured, like Elsa Rodriguez, who has not to this day regained the ability to walk or to speak because of the brain injury she received from a bullet in 2010. So what happened is that the journalists who were there, and I think this is important to you guys in labor news, they were threatened by the armed thugs to put their cameras down. But as soon as the thugs left, they actually registered what happened. And when the government officials and the trade union officials said, okay, this was a violent clash between two sectors, they showed who these mafiosos were and how they had ambushed this mobilization with absolute protection from police, who retired from the area, let them do the attack before returning. Okay, and so when the country saw that, there was a huge political reaction. We had 100,000 people in Plaza de Mayo. We had very strong pronouncements from all walks of life, artists, culture, who demanded justice for this. And this was a very strong movement which impacted on what the government was saying about itself and what it really was, so to speak. Okay, and this also really translated into a whole new generation of militants, in particular for the PO and for the left in general. And so the year after that, we formed the Left Front, which somehow was able to capitalize, so to say, on the independent position when it was split between two bourgeois sectors. And then through our participation in the class struggle and through being able to sort of really explain to a mass audience what the interests behind this conflict, which had come to national attention when our comrade was assassinated, were, to be able to really mount a united front and a very broad democratic movement for these people being taken to jail in a country where impunity from the law for powerful people is the norm. We were able to get Jose Pedraza, who had been the Secretary General of the Railway Workers Union since like 1980s. I don't remember the exact year, but over whatever, like 30 years at the head of the union, and who was a friend of the Ministry of Labor and of this, and supported by everybody. He was taken to jail. His lieutenants in the union were taken to jail. There were convictions against police officers who had prepared the conditions for this attack, and of course for the direct assassins, the hired assassins they had sent. So this was, a strong political movement, which it took many young people to identify with the figure of Mariano, who had been assassinated, and with the struggle that he represented. So the left front came together basically as an electoral bloc of the left parties, which were basically almost all of the parties who did not go in blocks with bourgeois sectors, were the sectors who said we present independently. Political independence of the working class is the main common political principle of the left unity front in Argentina. There are, of course, many points on our programs and platforms which we could discuss, important ones. The demands of workers, of the youth. A few weeks ago we finally conquered abortion rights for women in Argentina are now legal, and the left front is the only political force which has that on its platform. All the other parties, you have people for and against, because they say we give freedom of conscience, because some are religious or this or that. We say the freedom of women is not a problem of your conscience or your religious belief. It is something you have to recognize, and then you can you can have whatever creed you want, but you don't have you have no right to impose that on women or on anyone else, right? So all of these things, of course, are in our platform, but to try to describe it, I think the main points are: we are for the independent presentation of the working class as a political force. We participate actively in the class struggle and view parliamentary and electoral politics as part of the independent struggle of the working class, and not as a mean in itself. We are against political careerism, which is a method of the state to absorb leftist and working class politics. So all parliamentary positions that we achieve rotate between members of the different parties that are in the left front. None of us do a full term, and none of us cash the full wage that we are given. We only receive a working class wage, and the rest of it we put up for the funds for struggle. These seem to be maybe minor organizational points, but were understood by many workers and many people in Argentina to be a fundamental difference between working class politics and what bourgeois politics are. And
how many people have you been able to elect? What percentage of the vote are you getting?
Well, we've been around for almost a decade now, and so we've had different levels of representation. We have members in National Congress. Right now we have 2. We've had up to 4 at some point, and we've had ups and downs. National congressmen, and we've had participation of different degrees in about, I think, 10 different provinces on the like the state legislatures you have there. We've had some important votes. For example, the Partido Obrero alone, it wasn't actually the front in the northern province of Salta. We got about 20% in one, and we actually won the local election for a moment there. And in another province in Mendoza, we got 17% of the vote. I think that was 2015. So we've had certain situations which we've been able to take advantage of, so to speak, and which have propelled us forward. And we have local representation also on a city level in many cities across the country. Though in the large cities in the province of Buenos Aires, that's very restrictive. Well, I mean, it's not as restrictive as the electoral system in the States, which is, of course, much more difficult for a third party to get in. But it's actually harder in the Buenos Aires area to have a local councilman in one of the big proletarian districts here than a national congressman. So that's a bit weird. But we've had this representation, and we've had important working class leaders. Nestor Pitrola, who has been a leader of the print union and in general of class struggle unions in all these years, has been a national congressman. Romina del Pla, who's the general secretary of the largest local teachers union in the country, it's the teachers union of La Matanza, which is a very large traditional place of Peronism. It's a district with 2 million inhabitants. The teachers union is over 9,000 members, and she's a secretary general, and she's just finished in December her term. She was one of the signing members of the bill to legalize abortion in the country that just got that finally got passed after many years of struggle. So we definitely, and it is important for us to combine these electoral or parliamentary places and to use them to take the working class conflicts and processes into the parliament, to use that as a sounding board, as a stage to try to amplify those protests, and not as a means of accumulation of power in and of itself. What we want to do is use it as a space for agitation to get a new leadership for the working class movement, for the labor movement, which is the only way we're really going to be able to go for a profound transformation in our country.
We're speaking with Guillermo Kane. He is a leader, one of the leaders of the Workers' Party. And Guillermo, why don't you talk about the effect of COVID, the pandemic in Argentina, the response of the government, and what your United Front, your bloc, has been fighting for to defend the working class, the health system of Argentina.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. That's a very important point. So when the pandemic started, the Alberto Fernandez Peronist government tried to show itself as a very prudent and taking the lockdown very seriously and basing itself on science. And it tried to show the reactions of the Bolsonaro in Brazil, the Bolsonaro government in Brazil, or Boris Johnson, or Trump, and say, okay, these people, they're completely eccentric and imprudent and irresponsible, and we're really going to take care of this. And in the first months, he did very regular reports personally to the media where he showed the numbers and this and that. So, but what actually happened was that even though there was a formal lockdown, the capitalist companies pretty much were able to, after a few struggles or a bit of friction, were able to fully function at all moments, and not just essential sectors, but growingly, absolutely all the economy. So once that's happening, and of course, in lieu of a government where testing practically does not exist and case tracing does not exist, so all that exists is telling people, try to stay home, try to wear a mask. But they've pretty much taken it to a point where it's the individuals who are responsible for it, and the state absolutely takes no active policy. So what we've demanded are several points. First of all, we said to be able to guarantee health, we need to centralize the health system under the state and under workers' control, because you have big parts of the health system which are run by private companies, or which are run by, by the unions in a way, obras sociales, health plans of the unions. And so we said we need to centralize all of these resources, because maybe in the big cities, it hasn't gotten to the point where people don't have a hospital bed, but in many places of the country, it has reached in different moments this. And this has not been, there has been no response from the federal government to guarantee health, first off. Second, we've done a big campaign for working class protocols against COVID inside the factories. In unions where we have the leadership, for example, we have the leadership of the National Tire Workers Union. So in like the plants of Bridgestone, Pirelli, a local company, Fate, and other plants of tire workers, we were able to impose that work did not commence until acceptable protocols for controlling, contagion could be established, and that 100% of the wages were paid in suspension in the meantime. This, of course, was not the case in many other factories where suspensions, went for big wage cuts, where even though the government said it would, it signed a presidential decree saying that layoffs were forbidden unless unions and bosses reached a special agreement in the Ministry of Labor. So what happened was the unions, which respond to the government, signed off on all of the layoffs that the bosses presented to the tone of thousands of layoffs of formal workers. Of course, informal workers of the types that we talked about a bit before, got laid off without any such, in the thousands as well, and without any such ceremony. So what happened across over the months was the cases picked up very strongly, and Argentina is now 11th on the international ranking of cases and growing because the economy has not stopped. What happened at the same time was there's a big process of poverty and unemployment, which is growing violently because there has been no real, there have been very small checks. There were like, I think 4 checks in the whole year of a very low, very much below, what a family needs to live as income. And practically no wage increases in the unions. They maintain everything the whole year, very much suppressed economically, the working class taking advantage of the pandemic. So that has led to a process of impoverishment, one aspect of which is a big housing crisis, which led during the middle of the year, after the winter, like mostly August, September, to a big process of land seizures. The PO intervened very strongly in this whole process, also through our unemployed workers organization, which is called the Polo Obrero, in a land seizure, which was over 10,000 families here in the south of the greater Buenos Aires area. These land seizures were violently repressed by the government, who offered no solutions for workers who just weren't able to pay rent. So they occupied land which has no building on it, and in many cases no direct clear owner, and have tried to establish their houses there. But this movement has been violently repressed, and we have had dozens of comrades arrested for supporting these families, and who have now legal persecution, who have trials pending on resisting arrest, resisting authority, attacking the police, and all these sort of accusations that are falsified, that are constructed by the government to try to make people afraid of fighting back. So those are a few of the situations that have happened. What's going on now is the cases are spiking again. It's as strong as it was in winter here, which is in June, was the peak. It's now already back again to that point, and no measure is being taken to try to curtail the economic movement, which makes people get on buses, on trains to go to work every day. No subsidy is being given to be able to make workers clear of this situation. And the whole campaign of the government is just telling people to try to stay at home. And it says that the spikes are due to young people who meet and go to parties, as if this was the only dangerous situation which happens when the factories are functioning, the shops are open, so the people have to go to work everywhere, and this is where a big part of the contagion is going on. And of course, countries like ours are last on queue for the vaccines, which are dominated by the big laboratories of US and Europe. There have been all that has been achieved is a shipment of the Russian vaccines, 300,000, but a very small part of which the government has been able to muster the logistics to actually get people vaccinated. So we have about a 10% in almost a month, under 10% of the vaccines received have actually been used. So it's not looking very good, that prospect, because though they had announced deals with Pfizer and other of the labs for thousands of vaccines, and this had been told to the press, the reality is that production levels are slower than expected, and what is actually produced is given to the U.S. and Europe, and the lion's share of it is given to the U.S. and Europe.
And of course, Cuba actually has developed some vaccines as well. What are these blocs positioned towards U.S. intervention against Venezuela, the sanctions against Cuba, the role of U.S. Bipartisan policy of the Democrats and Republicans to basically crush those countries, the regimes? What do you think about the United States' role in Central Caribbean and Latin America?
Well, of course, we reject that. We are for the defeat of U.S. imperialism and for the socialist unity of Latin America, which we understand is the only way we can muster the strength to defeat the imperialist power, which has for over a century been exercising, overt or covert military interruptions of the political lives of our countries. We support the Cuban people against the blockade and the different sorts of, again, open or covert military and intelligence operations against them over the decades. That this does not mean political support for the bureaucracy of the state of Cuba, which has been working towards capitalist restoration and opening up new spaces for capitalist economy on the island for many years now, and are trying to actually increase that now to the point where the cutting off of tourism with COVID caused a huge drop in the gross national product of Cuba, which is dependent to a big degree on tourism today. So this is the state of things on the island. Now, of course, we are for independent organization of the workers in Cuba, political freedom for the workers in Cuba to discuss all these problems and to organize unions, especially to be able to defend themselves with the growing presence of capital on the island. What we are dead for and against is, the aggression of the U.S. Over all this time and the blockade. Now, in Venezuela, the same thing, and in Bolivia and wherever, the right wing, with the support of the U.S. in particular, has staged coups. In Venezuela, we have been active mobilizing and have been in Venezuela on several occasions against, the lockout against Chavez, what was it, 2003 or 2004, and all the coup attempts that have gone over the years. We have had very strong debates in the left on this because we are not Chavistas. We know that Chavez has spoken of socialism for the 21st century, but that this is not what the Venezuelan people are living. And even the fact that many workers have been swayed to support the right wing has to do with the very bad living conditions in Venezuela under Chavismo, which of course the U.S. blockade only serves to strengthen the lack of access to food, medicine, and the general misery. So we definitely reject that, and we think that an independent working class organization is the only way to fight for a better situation. More recently in Bolivia, the same has been true. Now, the coup in Bolivia had U.S. politicians, for example, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, were, according to different reports, handling, the coup operations together, mostly with bourgeois sectors and government officials, both from the Bolsonaro and Macri government at the time, the Argentine and Brazilian governments, together with Republican operatives, pretty much coordinated the coup in Bolivia. The PO played a big role in demonstrations in Argentina against the Bolivian coup, and in particular in the organization of Bolivian migrants here in Argentina, both in the demonstrations against the coup and in organizing to defend the right to vote in the recent elections, which, as you may know, were won by a general strike with roadblocks against the government that had been established by the dictatorship. Now, while we are not aligned with the bourgeois nationalist mass government, we do understand that the people of Bolivia took the idea of voting the mass against the government established by the coup as their opportunity to get this military dictatorship, which had assassinated workers, out of government. So in that sense, we defended their right to vote, not just rhetorically, but actually in many provinces here in Argentina, where since the migrant vote in Argentina was very strongly trended very strongly to vote against the right wing and in favor of the mass. They tried to block that, and we worked within the migrant community. We founded an organization of Bolivian workers in Argentina, which also very with a big presence of the Polo Obrero, which is our unemployed workers organization, which is several tens of thousands of members strong and active all over the country. Has a lot of Bolivian comrades, and we founded this organization, and we're active in practical terms to mobilize and to defeat the dictatorship in this neighboring country of ours.
And lastly, this insurrection and coup in the United States. First of all, what do people in Argentina think about it, about U.S. imperialism at this point, and what it means for not just the people of the United States, but people of the world and workers of the world?
Okay, that's a big question. Yeah, what do people think? Well, I think people are very concerned because, of course, wherever something that looks and feels like fascism starts rearing its head, workers, youths, and progressive people everywhere, of course, it's an impact, and we try to understand and we try to learn about what's going on. So there's been a big political interest. Like January 6th itself, we had like calls from comrades all over, and the next day we were already organizing a talk through Facebook, because of the pandemic, where hundreds of comrades participated just hours after what was going on. So there was a big interest in militants and friends of the PO, and I think in general, in Argentina. What everybody talks about and tries to understand is how this very powerful state with a very powerful bourgeoisie, which, as we said, is used to intervening in other countries, destabilizing them and changing their governments to suit their needs, suddenly becomes embroiled in a political crisis and process where these sort of situations, which they're used to commenting on abroad and generating abroad, talking about, of course, the government and the ruling classes are now suddenly on the streets in the US. And the other thing that's on the streets in the US, and which was very important to the PO and to Argentine militants in general, was the popular rebellion that we saw last year, which had, of course, a center in the George Floyd assassination and general killings of colored people by police, but which, was an expression in general of the impact of the capitalist crisis and the sort of situation that working people in the US are living, the young people in the US are living, and how they are starting to organize, and a sort of awareness that's going on there. That's of course been very exciting for us, and there's been very strong support, and the images of the people in the streets of the US, filled us with pride and with the sense that in a country which we are used to seeing to some extent as an enemy because of its intervention in our region, we know that there are working class people and people who are struggling, who are our natural allies in defeating US imperialism. So this is very important to us. And so definitely we are seeing things which have not happened, in this way probably ever in the States, and in some form or another for many decades. And what we understand that we saw on January 6th is the end of the Trump government, with several defeats, electoral defeats in Georgia, control of the Senate, and the final clarification that he was not going to be able to overturn the electoral college. And at the same time, he is not leaving the political stage, and whatever his personal fate may be, his actions in this call to in this coup attempt or this raid on the Capitol have equaled the launching of a fascist movement on a national scale in the United States. So these sorts of right-wing movements are not a particularity of the United States, nor are they the result of the odious or eccentric character of Donald Trump. They are an international trend. And this international trend has to do with bourgeois clashes because of the capitalist crisis, the tendency towards trade wars, towards clashes between Europe and the States, towards clashes over the control of China and Russia as capitalist restoration advances there, and in other places, Korea, and who is going to have control of this economic process. So this is causing divisions inside the bourgeoisie internationally and nationally in the US. And we understand that the big question is, how is the bourgeoisie in the US going to stop the retreat of its power internationally? Because its economic participation is dwindling, its geopolitical strength has also receded. And so this is what's being discussed. This is what Trump tried to give an outlet for with his methods, and he was not successful. No, the economic crisis became worse. The unemployment became worse. It's become the worst economic crisis since the 30s. And now Biden is talking about political normalization. But the idea that the capitalist crisis will just go away because we have a more traditional, staff of government is not going to happen. So what we think is that this political crisis and this decomposition, decay of the political system and its parties, which we are seeing in a Democratic Party which is increasingly divided and a Republican Party which is practically split, is that the way that the U.S. bourgeoisie is used to governing probably won't exist anymore, and a new situation is opening up. And in this new situation, we saw the rally you called the other day in San Francisco. Well, of course, we sent a text, greetings to it, and we think it is very important for the united front of the left, which has an independent class strategy in the US. And we want to collaborate with this. We think all revolutionaries in the world should be interested in this, because we need a nationwide independent working class voice in the States, which doesn't exist yet. And we think many groups and militants, it is necessary for them to converge towards this. The Partido Obrero is proposing that a new conference of Latin American and US revolutionaries be held. There was one last August. 50 organizations from all over the continent participated. We think current developments in the United States and in Latin America as well, for example, the rebellion in Peru, new strikes in Colombia, the reopening of protests in Chile, and of course the situation in the US, make it more necessary than ever. And we think a conference of the sort maybe could help trying to focus the energy of different groups and comrades in the US, because a working class party is necessary. And we think there are two main political problems, so to speak. One is the attitude of the working class towards the Biden government, which will use the Trump coup and the fascist movement as a way of saying any independent working class demands are siding with Trump against the government. Biden is democracy, and whoever defends the right to work, a decent wage, housing, health, and education is siding with the fascists. So this sort of blackmail has to be rejected, and it is very important to defend the urgent working class demands, which the whole situation and COVID and the recession have put forward. And on the other hand, we have fascism. And of course, we've read your statements and heard, and we absolutely agree that the only way to face fascism is united front, direct action on the streets, because there isn't going to be place on the streets for those who were in front of the popular rebellion last year and these fascist movements. And it's evident that no matter the impeachment that they voted, which Clyburn himself has said he prefers to not even send to the Senate, and the 100 people that are in jail, it's clear that the far right in the US is a reality which has been nurtured by bourgeois politicians from both big parties, which has a very strong presence in police forces, which has been financed by the large capitalist groups. And if there was a real investigation to root out the Ku Klux Klan, the white supremacist groups, the presence of these groups in the fraternal order of police around the country, it would be a lot of Democrats and Republicans and big bosses would show up on the list of those who have put this forward. So we don't think that it's going to be Biden who's trying to co-govern with McConnell, who's going to rout the fascists. It has to be the workers, it has to be the left, and it needs a united front to carry it out.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much for joining us. We've been talking with Guillermo Kane. He is one of the leaders of the Workers' Party in Argentina, talking about the history of Argentina, the struggle of the working class, the international crisis, including COVID, pandemic, and also the crisis in the United States, attempted coup and insurrection, and what that means for workers in the United States and workers around the world. So thanks for joining us on Work Week.
Thank you for the space, Steve.